All right, welcome everyone. I am Christopher Shaw. I'm a licensed clinical social worker and a supervisor. I'm a certified sex addiction therapist and a supervisor, and I'm also a registered yoga teacher. Let's see. Approved. Sorry, we're getting some memos here. People are still coming in. Welcome, welcome, welcome. I'm also a recovered addict, sex, drugs, rock and roll, you name it. My drug of choice was more, and I am grateful to be recovered from the disease of addiction. Whether you're joining us as someone struggling personally, a partner who has been impacted by a loved one's behavior, a therapist, coach, recovery professional, healer, or simply someone interested in the intersection of trauma, addiction, sexuality, and psychedelic-assisted healing, we are so grateful that you are here. Today's conversation explores one of the most misunderstood subjects in mental health and recovery: problematic sexual behaviors. Pornography, affairs, compulsive sexual behavior, hookup apps, escorts, anonymous sexual encounters, serial relationships, sexualized fantasy, love addiction, romance addiction, the secret lives that many people live while appearing successful, responsible, and put together on the outside.
Hello, everyone, and welcome again. I am Aeon Archer. I am an integrative healing arts practitioner and integration specialist with Merkaba Retreats. Before we begin, a few important disclaimers. This webinar is educational and informational in nature. It is not psychotherapy, medical treatment, or legal advice. Nothing discussed today should be interpreted as encouraging illegal activity. Psychedelics and earth medicines are not appropriate for everyone and carry risks, contraindications, and ethical considerations that we will discuss later. But most importantly, today is not about promoting psychedelics. It is about understanding suffering, understanding recovery, and understanding why so many intelligent, capable, successful people continue to engage in behaviors they genuinely want to stop, and what emerging science may say or may be teaching us about healing.
So we'd like to begin with a question. Have you or anyone that you know ever done something that you or they promised you would never do again? I have. Maybe you deleted the apps and said, I'm never going to go on that app again. Maybe you made promises. I will never cheat again, I promise. Maybe you confessed. Maybe you started therapy, went to meetings, read books, prayed, meditated, created boundaries, and swore that this time would be different. And yet somehow you found yourself right back to where you started. If so, you are definitely not alone. Over the last 18 years as a psychotherapist, addiction specialist, and recovery professional, I have sat with thousands of individuals who have asked some version of the same question. What is wrong with me? What am I missing? And why can't I stop? And what I've discovered is that most people are asking the wrong question, because the problem is often not the behavior. The problem is what the behavior is trying to solve. So I'd like to share a little bit about my own story. For much of my life, I looked successful externally. I earned degrees, I built businesses, I helped people, I led organizations, had relationships, achieved goals, and from the outside, everything looked relatively good. But underneath that success was a tremendous amount of pain, unresolved trauma, shame, fear, loneliness, and disconnection. Like many people, I learned early in life that difficult emotions weren't particularly welcome. So instead of feeling them, I escaped them. Alcohol, drugs, achievement, control, relationships, sex, porn, you name it. Anything that could create some relief, anything that could create distance from the discomfort I became addicted to. What I didn't understand at the time was that none of those behaviors were actually the problem. They were attempts to solve a deeper problem, right? My pain, my disconnection. The problem was my nervous system that didn't know how to regulate itself. I grew up in a very chaotic home. My nervous system learned to be on the edge of fight or flight from a very young age because my home life was very abusive, right? And so I was always trying to regulate, right? I think when I first found masturbation and alcohol and marijuana and some of those drugs, Freud says masturbation is actually like our first way that little kids actually learn how to soothe. Isn't that interesting? Good old Freud. But it's soothing, right? We touch ourselves, it feels good, and it becomes soothing. And for some of us, that can become addictive, right? Especially when our nervous system is always on edge. So when I entered recovery back in 2008, I initially believed that recovery was all about stopping the behaviors, right? It was about stopping drinking, stopping drugging, stopping the compulsive sexual behaviors, and so forth. And while behavioral change is absolutely so important, I eventually realized something profound. Stopping the behavior is not the same thing as healing. Many people, they stop acting out but remain deeply miserable. There are many people that stop drinking but remain emotionally disconnected. There are many people who stop watching pornography but continue living in shame. So the behavior may disappear, but the suffering remains. And that's when I began asking a different question. Not how do we stop the behavior, but what pain is the behavior trying to solve? That question transformed my recovery, and it also transformed my clinical work, and eventually led me into studying trauma, attachment, nervous system regulation, and more recently emerging psychedelic-assisted approaches to healing.
So, one of the greatest misconceptions about problematic sexual behaviors is that they're primarily about sex. In my own personal experience, they rarely are. What we have found is that these behaviors are often attempts to regulate emotional states: stress, loneliness, fear, boredom, shame, rejection, abandonment, and disconnection. So many people use sexual behaviors the same way others use alcohol, drugs, gambling, food, work, social media, you name it. All of these things as a means of escape, a means of relief, as a means of temporarily regulating the nervous system. So the challenge is that the relief never lasts very long, and eventually the solution becomes another source of suffering.
So over the years, I've worked with all kinds of people from all walks of life: CEOs, attorneys, physicians, seekers, therapists, pastors, entrepreneurs, recovery professionals, other therapists, people who appear extraordinarily successful, people that everyone admires and nobody suspects. And many of them are living with profound shame and secrecy. They're living double, triple, quadruple lives. And they come into my office and they say, I can't do this anymore. It is too overwhelming. I can't keep my story straight. People are starting to find things out. Somebody caught me online. My spouse caught me doing this. I got a text, blah, blah. And it just goes on and on. And none of these people are bad people, and they're not weak, and they're not immoral. They're just hurting, right? Because they've never been taught another way.
And this brings us to a conversation that is often discussed in recovery circles, and that is willpower.
Willpower.
So I want to talk about willpower because most recovery models begin with an assumption. If someone wants something badly enough, they'll do it. Unfortunately, human beings are more complicated than that, because if willpower were enough, no one would relapse. No one would smoke, no one would overeat, no one would remain in destructive relationships, and no one would repeatedly engage in behaviors that damage their lives. So the reality is that many problematic sexual behaviors provide something valuable. Like I said a moment ago, it's relief, temporary connection, or escape, and a way to regulate the nervous system. And the truth is that behavior works, at least in that moment. And because it works, the brain learns, the nervous system learns, and the pattern continues to strengthen. So when people attempt to remove the behavior without addressing the underlying pain, they often find themselves trapped. The suffering remains, and the coping strategy disappears. And eventually, the nervous system begins searching for relief again. This is one reason so many people feel defeated. They're trying to solve a trauma problem with a discipline solution. They're trying to solve an attachment problem with a behavioral solution. And they're trying to solve an emotional regulation problem with sheer force of will. And that rarely works long term.
So trauma isn't what most people think it is, right? When people hear the word trauma, many people, not those of us who are in the profession, but many people who aren't in the healing professions, They think it has to be some kind of catastrophic event, right? Like combat, abuse, violence, disasters, betrayal. Then those certainly are traumatic, but trauma is often far more subtle. Trauma can be growing up unseen, growing up emotionally neglected, growing up in a family where emotions were dangerous, growing up believing your worth depended on performance, or growing up feeling fundamentally alone. One trauma researcher famously describes trauma not as what happens to us, but what happens inside of us. The adaptations we create to survive, the beliefs we develop, and the ways we disconnect from ourselves. Many problematic sexual behaviors make perfect sense when viewed through a trauma lens, not because trauma excuses behavior, but because it helps explain behavior. And explanation creates the possibility for healing.
So, in my experience, shame is often the most powerful force maintaining problematic sexual behaviors, which is interesting because the problematic sexual behavior creates shame, and then the shame creates more problematic sexual behaviors. Because guilt says, I did something bad, and shame says, I am bad. And those are radically different experiences. Many people spend years trapped in a cycle that looks something like this: pain, acting out, relief. Shame, isolation. Pain, acting out, relief, shame, isolation, over and over and over again, and the cycle continues. But what makes shame particularly dangerous is that it thrives in secrecy. It wants silence. It wants isolation. It wants people to believe they're uniquely broken. But healing tends to happen in exactly the opposite environment: truth, connection, compassion, honesty, community, and right relationship.
So here's what the brain is teaching us. Over the last 20 years, neuroscience has transformed our understanding of addiction and compulsive behaviors. Our brain is constantly learning, it's constantly adapting, and constantly trying to increase survival and reduce suffering. When a behavior reliably reduces emotional distress, even temporarily, the brain pays attention. Neural pathways strengthen, habits develop, and associations form. This is not a moral failure, it's just biology. It's learning and adaptation. The encouraging news is that the brain remains capable of change. This is what we call neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to create new pathways, new responses, and new possibilities. And this is where researchers have become increasingly interested in psychedelic-assisted therapies.
So I want to begin with something important. At the time of this conversation, there are no large-scale clinical trials demonstrating that psychedelics are a proven treatment for compulsive sexual behavior disorder. So that's important to say out loud, not because it diminishes the conversation, but because it grounds it in reality. But when people are hurting, it's natural to want certainty. It's natural to want an answer, a solution, something that finally explains why we keep ending up in the same place despite our best intentions. But the truth is, we are still in the early stages of understanding what role, if any, these medicines may ultimately play in that healing process. But what has caught my attention and the attention of researchers, clinicians, and recovery professionals isn't that psychedelics appear to solve sexual compulsivity. It's that many of the underlying struggles driving problematic sexual behaviors are the very same struggles being explored throughout psychedelic-assisted therapy research. Trauma, shame, loneliness, attachment wounds, emotional avoidance, psychological rigidity, big one. So when I've sat with people struggling with compulsive sexual behavior, and when I've looked honestly at my own coping mechanisms throughout different seasons of my life, one thing becomes difficult to ignore. The behavior is rarely the whole story. The behavior is simply the part that's visible, like an iceberg, the tip of the iceberg. Underneath it, it is often something much older, something much more vulnerable. A person trying to escape pain, trying to soothe loneliness, or quiet the shame. Or a person trying to feel connected, even if only for a moment. Or trying to feel something that feels impossible to carry. Because if a behavior is serving a purpose, it is helping someone numb, distract, regulate, escape, avoid, or temporarily connect. Then removing the behavior doesn't automatically resolve the suffering underneath it, because the grief remains. The loneliness remains, the wound remains. And that's why so many people discover that stopping a behavior and healing the reason for the behavior are not necessarily the same thing. And what I found fascinating about some of the psychedelic research isn't the promise of a cure, it's something much, much simpler. Researchers use terms like psychological flexibility, emotional processing, self-compassion, and reduced experiential avoidance. Those are useful clinical phrases, but in everyday language, what they often point toward is this. People become more willing to feel what they've spent years trying not to feel. And that may sound simple until you really sit with it, because so much of human behavior revolves around avoiding emotional pain, avoiding grief, avoiding abandonment, avoiding rejection, simply put, avoiding vulnerability, avoiding the uncomfortable parts of being human. Again and again, whether the conversation is addiction, relationships, work, achievement, or even spirituality, the same pattern keeps appearing. We become remarkably skilled at running away from ourselves. One reason addiction research has generated so much interest is because studies involving alcohol use disorders, tobacco addiction, and other substance use disorders have shown promising outcomes when psychedelic-assisted therapy is combined with psychotherapy and integration. Not because people suddenly become more enlightened, not because a medicine removes all desire, and not because difficult emotions simply disappear. What they're finding and observing is often far more human than that. People let their walls down. They become less rigid, more emotionally available, more willing to look honestly at their lives from another perspective, and more willing to examine the stories that they have been telling themselves, more willing to confront the pain they've spent years avoiding. And if you spend any time in recovery communities, those themes are familiar. Shame, secrecy, avoidance, compulsion, and isolation. The exhausting experience of repeating a pattern you no longer want while feeling powerless to do anything about it. Similar questions are emerging in research involving obsessive compulsive disorders and compulsive behavioral patterns. These are not the same thing as problematic sexual behavior, and it's important not to blur those distinctions, but they are interesting similarities. The repetitive thoughts, compulsive urges, ritualized behavior, the feeling of being trapped inside loops that continue long after they've stopped serving us. Researchers have become increasingly interested in whether psychedelic experiences may create enough space inside those loops for something different to emerge. Not because the pattern instantly disappears, but because people may experience themselves as something larger than the pattern. For even a brief moment, they're no longer completely fused with the urge. And sometimes a moment like that changes absolutely everything. Then there are earth medicines such as iboga and ibogaine. Some of the reports coming from those experiences are absolutely remarkable. People describe vivid life reviews, forgotten memories, which are usually the root of a lot of those patterns, surfacing. Old grief returning into the awareness, childhood experiences suddenly connecting to present-day behaviors in ways that had never been visible before. Not because the medicine cured anything, but because material that had been buried beneath years of defenses, distractions, and survival strategies became available for examination. Over the years, Christopher and I have witnessed this firsthand. We've watched individuals reconnect with grief they had buried for decades. We've seen childhood abandonment wounds emerge from places people didn't realize were still influencing their lives. And we've witnessed profound loneliness hidden beneath achievement, sexuality, relationships, addiction, perfectionism, and endless activity. We have sat with people who discovered levels of self-hatred that had quietly shaped their entire lifetime. And what struck me wasn't the intensity of those moments, it was what happened afterward. For the first time, many of these individuals weren't running. They weren't reaching for a distraction. They weren't numbing themselves with social media. They were simply sitting with what was there. And from that place, something new became possible for them. Freedom, compassion, honesty, acceptance, responsibility, but more importantly, choice. The longer I've been around this work, the less interested I've become in the idea that the medicine heals people. What becomes visible again and again is that the medicine doesn't heal the wound. The medicine will illuminate the wound. It may reveal what has been hidden. It may bring into awareness what has spent years operating in the shadows. But healing happens in relationship. Healing happens through honesty, through therapy and integration. It happens through recovery work, community, and it happens through the thousands of ordinary choices that follow an extraordinary experience. And perhaps that's one of the most compelling responsibilities in this entire field.
Possibilities. Compelling possibility.
Oh, possibilities.
Responsibility.
Oh, I thought compelling possibilities. Not that psychedelics are earth medicines, not that psychedelics or earth medicines cure people, but that they may help people encounter the very experiences they've spent years, sometimes decades, trying to outrun. And once those experiences can be seen clearly, new possibilities emerge. Choice becomes possible, accountability becomes possible, and healing becomes possible. Not guaranteed, but possible. Of course, none of this makes these medicines magic because they're not. And they're not appropriate for everyone. They're not risk-free. They do not replace therapy. They do not replace recovery community. They do not replace spiritual practice. At their best, they appear to offer something much more modest and much more profound. A doorway, a catalyst, and a chance to see clearly. And what happens after that moment of clarity is where the real work begins. Because recovery has never seemed to be about having an extraordinary experience. I've known many people who have had extraordinary experiences. The more important question is always what happened afterward? How did they respond when life became difficult again? How did they treat the people around them? Could they stay present when the discomfort returned? Could they continue telling the truth when the excitement fades? And could they keep showing up for themselves? Recovery is ultimately less about what happens during a ceremony and more about who we become afterward. That's where preparation matters, integration matters, support matters, and the community around this work matters. Because insight may open the door, but walking through it and continuing to walk long after the experience has ended is where transformation actually takes root. Woo! I know, that was a mouthful.
It's a lot. You might want to rewind and listen to that section again, everyone.
A lot.
That was a lot. All right, let's kind of put it into perspective here. You know, Aeon and I are down here in Puerto Vallarta, Mexico, where the beautiful earth medicines here are legal in sacred ceremony, right? And we facilitate earth medicine retreats down here in Puerto Vallarta, and a number of our brothers and sisters who have come down here to heal with us are in recovery. And many of them at different stages of recovery, right? We had a female who came here for a private retreat a few months ago. She's been in recovery probably 15 years, wanting to go deeper and clear out some stuff, come here to find some clarity, get some answers, right? We had another man who came down here who's been struggling with pornography addiction for a long time. Isolation, shame, secrecy, all of that, religious abuse growing up and so forth. And it was so beautiful to be able to spend a week with him, right, where we could just see the onion dissolve, right? And him going home with a whole new set of tools to be able to deal with life on life's terms, right?
Well, you could also see, like, when he first got here, you could see the weight in his body,
the self-hatred weight,
all of it, like his body reflected in the way he carried his shoulders, how he moved, how tight he was. And over the course of the week, you started to see, as he was working through the ceremonies and the stuff that was coming up, like his body softened as a reflection of the deeper work that he was uncovering and able to get to, like, to surrender.
Yeah, you know, sexual shame it's just the worst. It's a lot of the sexual shame that I think that we carry is what's called carried shame. It's not even ours, right? It's given to us by our parents. It's given to us by religion. It's given to us by our communities. For example, gay men. Many gay men are given the carried shame by their community that their sex is wrong, sinful, dirty, disgusting, and so forth. And so they have shame around many sexual behaviors, even just sexual behaviors that normal people might say, well, why are you ashamed of that? That's just normal sex. Well, gay men have all this carried shame, right? And so what I have found in my 18 years of working with people from across all orientations and across all genders is that when you carry so much shame around sexual behaviors and you find a drug like crystal meth or other drugs that allow you to lower your inhibitions, what happens is that people are able to forget for a little bit all that shame that they carry around being sexual, right? And so they'll use drugs.
Well, and the interesting thing about sexual behavior is that is your life force energy. So when you have shame around your life force energy, it just affects every other area of your life.
No, absolutely, absolutely. And so, and then drugs are, and so then before you know it, you have a chemsex addiction because drugs are helping people eliminate the shame temporarily. And these people are then able to be sexual in ways that they never would be able to do without the drugs, only to find themselves back in the same shame cycle, when it's all over. And 2 days later, you're like, I did what? I did what? I did what? You know what I mean? Like, what? Right. And it might not have done anything weird, but like for you, you were like, whoa, this is not something that how I want to live my life. Right. So we work with a lot of people that are carrying a lot of shame and a lot of sexual shame because it was given to them. Right.
Well, and what's interesting about that is it's kind of like cycle on top of addictive cycle on top of the other, and eventually like the original hurt gets buried so deep down in our psyche that it's almost impossible to access. And that's one of the things that the psychedelic assisted therapy does is it allows us to access the original pain point in a way where you can actually start to work with it. Instead of having to go like one cycle at a time in order to get down to the root, it's like in one ceremony, you're able to access the root of that pain and finally be able to look at it and do some real deep work on the root of that pain.
Absolutely. Like what I have found in my own work with psychedelics and earth medicines is that it goes right for the core. They go right for the core. They open the doorway so that I can eliminate the core of the whatever onion it is that I want to eliminate, right? Instead of peeling back the layers and looking at them and holding them and wanting to know like da 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 da. Yes, that's useful, right, to be able to do that. But eventually, if I don't get rid of the core or heal the core of my onion, then I'm probably setting myself up for a life that is not as free, right, as one without that, right? And setting myself up for relapse and more shame and all of that jazz, right? So the psychedelics are beautiful for that. Also, there are earth medicines that are not psychedelics that can heal the body because we store trauma in the body, we store all kinds of stuff in our bodies. And so the Mother Earth has really provided us with everything we need to heal. And then one other thing I wanted to mention is that, you know, and Aeon said it, this is not a replacement for therapy or a replacement for treatment, right? Like when we'll have people that will call us and say, I need a retreat, but I'm really struggling with addiction. And we ask them, well, have you been to treatment? Have you done anything, any kind of therapy or any 12 steps or anything like that? And if they say no, we're not just going to bring them in right away because I firmly believe that people in recovery need to have some kind of recovery structure and community in place before they embark upon a plant or earth medicine healing retreat, right? I prefer that our clients have at least 3 months sober. They have a sponsor or a mentor. They have some kind of community. They have a program. They are doing the deal and they are gaining those tools, right? Because when they leave here, they're going to need to continue to use those tools in the real world in order to assist them in staying sober. And so they're not going back and reinstalling those old programs or being triggered and lighting up that neural pathway and going back into those old behaviors, right?
That's the preparation piece. There's a process to be properly prepared to have this experience so it can be meaningful and lead to lasting change. It's not something you're like, oh, one day you're just going to go do an earth medicine ceremony to fix your life. It doesn't really quite work like that. I've been doing this work for 15 years, and I tried that 15 years ago, and it's not that simple. So preparation leading up to the experience is incredibly important.
Yeah, and we do help with that, right? We help people's therapists actually help them to prepare and so forth. So it's really kind of a beautiful process. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about risks, limitations, and some ethics, because I do think that that's important. So the psychedelic approach is not appropriate for everyone, right? There are some individuals that may face increased risks related to psychosis, bipolar disorder, certain medical conditions, medication interactions, or other factors. There are also some significant ethical concerns. There are poorly trained facilitators out there. There is inadequate screening. There is lack of preparation, lack of integration. There are reports of boundary violations and even spiritual bypassing. So if you're searching for this kind of work or this kind of healing center, it is very important that you know your facilitators, you know their background, you know their training, you've read reviews, you've read testimonials, you ask them about preparation, integration, what are their boundaries, what are their ethics, and all of that stuff is very, very important. The medicine itself it's rarely the greatest risk. The container is the greatest risk. So that brings us to one of the most important parts of today's conversation. And I already touched a little bit on preparation, facilitation, and now I'm going to invite him to talk about integration because he is our integration specialist here at Merkaba Retreats. And
No,
he's the one to talk to about it.
Well, like I said, most people focus on the ceremony. Like that's the key focus. But transformation doesn't begin with the ceremony, and it doesn't end with the ceremony either. Because transformation begins with your intention.
Yeah.
Especially for people in recovery, intention is important. And we have to be really careful and like really check in with ourselves. And it's one of the things we do in our application process when we're working with people is we want to get to the root of what is their intention. Because for people in recovery, sometimes the intention can become seeking an experience to get outside of yourself. So a part of that preparation is honesty and willingness, some of the key principles of recovery itself. And it continues through the integration after the ceremony. Because one of the biggest misunderstandings in psychedelic culture is the belief that insight equals change. But it doesn't.
No.
Many people will have profound experiences, but few people consistently integrate those experiences into their life. So healing occurs when insight becomes action, when awareness becomes practice, and when realization becomes embodiment. So the goal is not to have an extraordinary experience. The goal is to live differently because of what was revealed in your experience. And that requires support, community, practice, and accountability. And often a willingness to continue doing difficult emotional work long after the ceremony ends. Which is one of the reasons why, as a part of Merkaba retreats, we have alumni, we have integration calls, preparation calls, continued work with all of the people who work with us. They become a part of our community and a part of our family, so they stay really closely connected with us.
Yeah, and a personalized integration plan, because it can be, you come down here, you destroy the onion that you've been carrying around your whole life, you leave here like a little infant, like just fresh in the world. But the world has not changed, right? You have. And so it can be very shocking to go back into a world or back into groups of people that are not doing the same work that you just did, right? And so we really do help our clients have a plan to deal with the world or the family or the partner or the kids or whatever they're going to encounter when they go home, right? So that they're able to maintain, what they've gained in their retreats.
And customized integration is incredibly important because a one-size-fits-all integration does not work.
No.
Because everyone's life is different. Everyone comes down here carrying something different. They're going home to different circumstances, different situations. So like each it's really important to customize the integration for where they are spiritually, what spiritual practices work for them, what relationships are they going back to, how do they stay connected to what they opened and what they experienced during their retreat. And that looks different for everybody.
Now, I want to say before we go into Q&A, I just want to speak to those who are joining us who are partners of sex addicts or partners of those who have problematic sexual behaviors. I am also a partner in recovery. And I know what it's like to be an addict, and I know what it's like to be the one who was betrayed, right? And so it's beautiful that I'm able to kind of see both sides of that and help my clients who are addicts and betrayed partners and couples recover. Interestingly enough, over 90% of couples who enter recovery from betrayal trauma, who follow the certified sex addiction therapist model, right, with formal disclosure and so forth, and who continue to do the work, actually in research, they have found that those couples actually heal and they continue to be together and succeed. So that's like 87%. That's a huge, huge, huge number. And I love working with couples who are in recovery from betrayal trauma. It's beautiful to see an addict recover. And it's also beautiful to see a partner like look at his or her part, right? And grow and evolve. And then for them to come down here, right? Like we'll have a lot of couples that will come down here to do retreats with us because they're at a place in their recovery where they're ready to start reconnecting. Like they've gone through formal disclosure, they've reestablished trust. They're working on slowly reintroducing sexual intimacy, physical intimacy into their lives again. And they will come down here and do a week with us. That is just a beautiful, beautiful week with the Sacred Earth Medicines that allows them to kind of dissolve and heal things that are even deeper, right? For each of them individually and then together as a couple, so that really as they move forward, they're moving forward with a totally clean slate, which is so, so, so important and so beautiful, right? Because if you don't do that, and both partners are not doing the work, then you run the risk of having a pretty miserable, I think, relationship moving forward, because one person's always going to be like, remember when you cheated on me? And the person, like, haven't you worked through this already? And I'm in recovery. And I mean, you can just be like that I do see that happen when both partners are not doing the work, right? Or someone will relapse and it's like, oh, you did that again. And so it's beautiful, so beautiful when both people are doing their recovery work, right? And then they do the deeper work and then they really clear the slate. Oh, wow. It's pretty incredible what you can build when the slate is totally clean and you're able to build like a super, super solid, high vibe foundation for your relationship. Beautiful. All right. So I'm going to pause the recording here and we're going to do some Q&A. So if anybody here in the house, hold on one second, guys. All right, we were just coming back from questions, and what I was sharing with everybody that was here today for the webinar is that if you would like more information about our retreats, the website is merkabaretreats.com. And if you would like to schedule a call with me or Aeon or both of us, you can do that at archershaw.guru/book online. archershaw.guru/book online. We would love, love, love to talk to you, to help you to go deeper. Also, our email is archershaw@merkabachurch.com. It's not Merkaba Church anymore. It's Merkaba Temple now, but Gmail makes it hard to change a good domain once you got one. So that is our email for the moment, archershaw@merkabachurch.com for those of you who would like to email us. Anything that you would like to add before we close?
No, I'm just happy that you're here. We are totally interested and excited to get to know all of you. And yeah.
All right.
That's it.
So for many years, I, like many of us, believed that recovery was just about stopping behaviors. Today, I see it differently because recovery is about becoming the kind of person who no longer needs the behavior. And that requires far more willpower, far more than willpower, and requires honesty, open-mindedness, and willingness. With these, we are well on our way.
That's right.
Compassion, connection, trauma healing, nervous system regulation, self-awareness, and community. For some individuals and couples, psychedelics and earth medicines may become one part of that journey. And not because they fix people, but because they sometimes help people access truths that they've spent years avoiding. And healing begins when truth becomes possible. All right. So please reach out to us. We would love to hear from all of you. And we are just so grateful that you are here today. Every 2 weeks, we do a webinar on Friday regarding the earth medicine, psychedelics, and addiction recovery. So be on the lookout for our next webinar. And until then, have a great day, everyone. Take care.
Bye.